When Elias Winter stood before his grand piano, dust settling on the ivories, a feeling of unease crept up his spine. It had been years since he'd touched it, years since he'd written a single note of music. The once renowned composer, whose symphonies had captivated the world, now found himself in a quiet corner of the world, surrounded by the weight of forgotten masterpieces and the silence of his own abandonment. The world had moved on. His name had become a whisper, his music little more than an echo in the halls of history. For decades, Elias had retreated from the public eye, sinking deeper into his seclusion as the need for creativity faded into nothingness. His fame had turned to dust, his accolades becoming mere artifacts of a life he no longer recognized. But that morning, while going through his old manuscripts, something strange had caught his eye, a melody he didn't remember writing. It was buried in the far corner of an old music box, one of the hundreds of forgotten notes and compositions that had piled up over the years. The melody was unfinished, just a few fragmented lines of music, written in his own hand, yet it seemed foreign to him. The notes didn't follow the same structure as his usual compositions, nor did they feel like something he would have written. The melody was off, somehow. At first, Elias thought it was an error, a forgotten idea that he'd abandoned long ago. But when his fingers brushed against the fragile manuscript, a chill ran down his back. There was something more to it, something he couldn't explain. The notes seemed to vibrate under his touch, calling to him. With trembling hands, he sat at the piano. The keys seemed to beckon him, as though the instrument itself were alive, waiting for him to play. Hesitantly, he pressed the first key, then the second, following the odd, incomplete melody. The notes felt familiar and alien at the same time, slipping through his fingers like ghosts. But the more he played, the clearer it became. The music wasn't his, it was something else, something much darker. As the melody echoed through the quiet house, Elias felt a subtle shift in the air. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. The soft hum of the music filled the space, vibrating in his chest, rattling his thoughts. There was a moment, a terrible, unsettling moment, when the music stopped making sense. And then, without warning, the piano's tone began to distort. The notes bent and twisted, sounding wrong, out of tune, but not in a way that could be fixed with a simple turn of a key. It was as though the very fabric of reality had been stretched too thin. His heart raced, and his breath quickened. He pulled his hands away from the keys, but the music continued, louder now, playing by itself. The air thickened. Suddenly, a shadow flickered at the corner of the room. It was brief, so brief that Elias thought his eyes had betrayed him. But then it happened again. The shadow moved, as if it were no longer bound by the laws of space and time. It stretched across the walls, swarming like a dark mist, and Elias felt it closing in on him. The piano continued to play. Terrified, Elias bolted upright. The shadow pulsed, surging toward him, and for the first time in years, he was gripped with a cold, suffocating feeling of fear. What had he unleashed? As the melody played on, Elias saw the walls of his study warp. His reflection in the darkened windows twisted and contorted. The room grew colder still, until his breath came out in visible clouds. The floor beneath him felt uneven, as though the ground itself was buckling. His mind began to race. He had to stop the music. He had to silence it. But the music was already too deep within him, pulling at the edges of his sanity. Each note that rang out seemed to unravel his thoughts. The shadow in the corner of the room began to take form, shapes that were barely human. Twisted, contorted faces flickered in and out of existence in the darkness, all of them fixed on him. The figures were watching, waiting. The melody reached its climax, the notes crashing into each other in a frenzy, dissonant and chaotic. As the final chord echoed, Elias felt something stir behind him. A figure, tall, skeletal, and draped in a cloak of shadow, stepped out from the corner of the room. Elias froze. It was real. The being was real. The figure moved toward him, the air growing colder with each step it took. Its face was obscured, but Elias could feel its gaze, the weight of its eyes pressing against him, pushing him deeper into panic. "You should not have played it," a voice whispered, though its mouth did not move. It was a voice that scratched at his bones, cold and hollow. Elias tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. His body was frozen, as if the very air around him had turned to stone. The figure reached out, its hand a skeletal claw. As it touched his chest, Elias felt his heart freeze. "You have awakened us," the voice said, growing louder. "Now we are free." The shadows in the room surged forward, coiling around Elias, pulling him toward the center of the room. The piano continued to play, a violent, unrelenting force that seemed to consume everything around him. The room twisted and distorted, folding in on itself. But Elias fought. He had to stop it. He had to silence the music before it destroyed him completely. With every ounce of willpower he had left, he pushed himself toward the piano, reaching out with trembling hands. The shadows seemed to retaliate, but Elias didn't care. He slammed his hands onto the keys, trying to force the music to stop. But the piano was no longer a mere instrument. It was a gateway, a bridge between the world of the living and something much darker, something that had been waiting for centuries. The moment his hands made contact with the keys, everything went silent. For a heartbeat, there was only silence, an oppressive, suffocating silence that filled the room. Elias's breath caught in his throat. Had he succeeded? But then, the shadows erupted, swirling around him. The room spun. His vision blurred. He was falling. When Elias opened his eyes again, the room was gone. The piano, the walls, the floor, everything had vanished. He was standing in a vast empty space, suspended in a void of blackness. The music echoed through the emptiness, distant but persistent. And in the distance, Elias could make out shapes, figures moving in the dark. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." But it was too late. The melody had been finished. The door had been opened. And now, Elias was trapped. He had become part of the song.